The morning of February 24th, 1986, in Los Angeles began like so many others, sun streaming across palm-lined streets, the hum of traffic building with the day, and the quiet rhythm of a city never quite asleep. In a Van Nuys condo, tucked away from the city's chaos, the life of Sherri Rasmussen, a 29-year-old nurse, newly married and already a leader in her field, was brutally cut short. By late afternoon, her husband, John Ruetten, returned home to find the unimaginable. The condo door ajar, shards of glass from the sliding door glinting on the carpet, furniture overturned, a struggle frozen in time, and in the living room his wife, motionless, blood pooling beneath her body. Panic collided with disbelief. This wasn't just a burglary, wasn't just a random act of violence, yet that was the story detectives rushed to embrace. A robbery gone wrong, they said, an intrusion that escalated. A simple explanation for a crime scene that, even at first glance, told a far more complicated story. Sherri lay on her back, her body riddled with gunshot wounds. A gun pressed against her chest had left a telltale contact mark. Bruises and cuts testified to a violent struggle, one that lasted long enough to leave broken vases and scattered possessions in its wake. Her face bore scratches and swelling, signs of a desperate fight for her life. One detail, small but searing, lingered above all else. A bite mark etched into her arm. It was intimate, almost personal, a savage signature in the middle of an already brutal attack. Yet as detectives surveyed the scene, their focus narrowed not on the strange intimacy of the violence, but on the narrative that fit neatly into the puzzle of Los Angeles crime in the mid-1980s. This was a burglary, they insisted. A break-in that had spiraled into murder when the homeowner confronted the intruders. The sliding door had been shattered. Valuables appeared disturbed, and the neighborhood had seen its share of thefts. Their conclusion seemed, at the time, logical enough, but to those who knew Sherri, her parents, her friends, even John, it was hard to reconcile. A burglary? Why would a burglar linger long enough to beat and bite their victim? Why would a random thief stage such ferocity only to flee empty-handed? The case was labeled tragic but straightforward. And with that label, the investigation was boxed in before it even began. In criminal investigations, the earliest assumptions often shape the course of justice. The robbery gone wrong theory became the foundation of the Rasmussen case. Detectives combed through possible suspects who matched that narrative, local criminals, known burglars, drifters. But nothing fit neatly. Meanwhile, crucial details, like the bite mark, like the unusual closeness of the violence, were cataloged but not pursued. Sherri's murder was filed under the growing list of unsolved cases in a city where violent crime was anything but rare. For Sherri's family, however, the explanation rang hollow from the start. Her father, Nels Rasmussen, would later say he knew, almost instinctively, that something was off, that his daughter hadn't been killed by strangers, that someone with motive had turned her own condo into a battleground. But in 1986, those suspicions were drowned out by official certainty. The police assured them they were chasing leads, following evidence, doing all they could. The family clung to hope, even as weeks turned to months, and months to years. The Los Angeles of the mid-1980s was a city in flux. Gang violence, drug wars, and rising homicide rates often stretched the LAPD thin. For detectives, patterns offered comfort, categorize crimes, find the familiar, move cases forward. A young woman shot in her home, jewelry disturbed, glass broken. It looked like a burglary. It fit the pattern. And yet, what the surface suggested and what the truth demanded were two very different realities. Unbeknownst to those early investigators, the real killer wasn't a faceless burglar at all. She was someone who carried a badge, someone who walked among them, someone they might have passed in the hallway at Parker Center. In the weeks after Sherri's murder, the condo was cleaned, evidence bagged, leads pursued and abandoned. Detectives insisted to the grieving Rasmussen family that it had been a tragic break-in, a senseless act of violence by people they might never find. Life, cruelly, moved on. John mourned and tried to rebuild. Sherri's parents grieved in quiet devastation, refusing to let go of the conviction that justice had been denied. And in the city beyond their personal nightmare, the case slowly faded from headlines and memory. But evidence doesn't forget. The bite marks swabbed for DNA, the fingerprints lifted from shards of glass, The inconsistencies written into case files all lay dormant, waiting for a future where technology would speak louder than assumptions. Sherri Rasmussen had been just 29 years old. She was a nurse, a director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, beloved by colleagues for her compassion and admired for her leadership. Her marriage to John was new, her dreams vast, her future brimming with promise. On that February day, all of it was stolen. Not just her life, but the decades she might have lived, the patients she might have healed, the children she might have raised, the memories she might have made. Her story was reduced to a file in a cabinet, a case number on a list of unsolved homicides. For more than 2 decades, justice was out of reach. But justice, though delayed, would not be denied. The story of Sherri Rasmussen isn't just the story of a murder. It is the story of how truth can be buried beneath assumptions, how power can shield the guilty, and how perseverance can ultimately force the past to speak. This is the story of a life stolen and of the long, winding road to justice. When we speak of Sherri Rasmussen today, it is often through the lens of tragedy, her murder, the investigation, the decades-long search for justice. But before the crime, before the silence, before her name became tied to words like cold case and DNA breakthrough, there was simply Sherri, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a wife. A young woman whose life brimmed with light, determination, and love. To understand the depth of what was stolen, we must first understand what existed. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957, in Loma Linda, California, to Nels and Loretta Rasmussen. From the very beginning, she stood out, not only in her family, but in the world she was stepping into. Her parents would later recall her as inquisitive, sharp, and deeply empathetic. She was the kind of child who asked more questions than she was expected to. Not just the whys of childhood curiosity, but the what-ifs of a mind already reaching for answers. What if I can help? What if things can be better? What if I try harder? Her father, Nels, remembered how, even as a girl, Sherri had a sense of responsibility beyond her years. If her sisters were upset, she was there to comfort them. If a neighbor was sick, she would ask if she could bring them food. Compassion, it seemed, was written into her character. But Sherri was more than gentle kindness. She had a streak of determination that her family would come to recognize as the driving force behind her life. She believed in working hard, in doing more than what was expected, in making her presence matter. That determination, paired with her empathy, would eventually shape her path. By high school, Sherri already knew she wanted to pursue nursing. She wasn't drawn by the glamour of medicine, nor by the prestige of being a doctor. For Sherri, nursing represented something different, the human side of healing. It was about presence, care, and the ability to stand by people in their most vulnerable moments. At Loma Linda University, she pursued her studies with relentless dedication. Professors saw her as a standout, not just for her intelligence but for her leadership qualities. Sherri was the kind of student who lifted others, who turned group projects into collaborative successes rather than competitions. By the time she was in her 20s, she had already achieved more than many twice her age. She became the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, a role that carried immense responsibility. Imagine that, a woman not yet 30, leading an entire department, managing staff, mentoring new nurses, and ensuring that patient care remained at the highest standard. Colleagues admired her, patients trusted her, supervisors leaned on her. She was, in every sense, a rising star in a field where compassion and competence don't always walk hand in hand. Her parents were proud, of course, but more than that, they were humbled by her drive. They had raised a daughter who not only succeeded but inspired. But Sherri was not just her profession. Friends remember her as warm, approachable, with a laugh that filled a room. She had the rare ability to balance intensity with levity. Yes, she was serious about her work, but she was also quick to share a joke, to put others at ease, to turn difficult days into bearable ones. She loved reading. She loved music. She loved the small rituals of life. Coffee in the morning, family dinners, and quiet evenings. Though ambitious, she was not consumed by ambition. What she wanted most, beyond career and achievement, was a life of meaning. That desire for meaning brought her to John Ruetten. When Sherri met John Ruetten, it was the beginning of a love story that seemed destined. John was younger, just out of UCLA, with boyish charm and a future wide open before him. Their paths crossed, and something clicked. Those who knew them recalled the way Sherri looked at John, with warmth, with patience, with the deep affection of someone who saw not only who he was, but who he could be. John, in turn, admired Sherri's drive, her maturity, her steadiness. The relationship blossomed quickly. In 1985, they married, committing themselves to a future together. For Sherri, marriage was not the end of her independence, but the beginning of a partnership. She continued to thrive in her career, and John began building his own. Their condo in Van Nuys became the space where their life together unfolded. Newlyweds, building routines, planning dreams, trips to take, friends to host. A family they might one day start. It was, by every measure, a time of promise. By 1986, Sherri Rasmussen had become a woman whose life embodied possibility. She was respected in her field, deeply loved by her family, and just beginning her married life. Her parents saw in her the fulfillment of years of hope. Her colleagues saw a leader whose career could only ascend. John saw his partner, his confidant, his wife, and yet, behind the walls of their condo, fate was already circling. Choices made by others, choices rooted in obsession, jealousy, and entitlement, were closing in. Stephanie Lazarus, John's former girlfriend and an officer with the LAPD, had never fully let go of the relationship. Her shadow lingered even as John and Sherri built their life together. At the time, no one could known how far that shadow would reach. In the weeks leading up to her death, Sherri was alive in all the ways that mattered. She was leading at work, loving at home, and moving forward with optimism. She was, by all accounts, happy. Her father would later recall the last phone call he had with her, just days before the murder. She was upbeat, talking about work, about her marriage, about the future. There was no sense of foreboding, no warning of the storm about to break. And that is perhaps the hardest truth of all. Sherri Rasmussen did not live a life defined by tragedy. She lived a life defined by promise, by compassion, by love. The tragedy was not in who she was, but in how abruptly and brutally it was taken away. Looking back, it is impossible not to measure what was lost. The patients she never treated, the nurses she never mentored, the children she never had, the anniversaries she never celebrated with John, the quiet evenings with her parents, the laughter with her sisters, the countless days that should have stretched out before her. All of it ended on one February afternoon in 1986. A life of promise, extinguished in violence. But as with all lives cut short, Sherri's story does not end at her death. It lingers, in the memories of those who loved her, in the fight for justice that her parents waged, and in the case files that one day would be reopened, bringing with them the truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Sherri Rasmussen lived just 29 years, but in those years she touched countless lives. She embodied compassion, excellence, and love. To reduce her to a victim is to overlook the fullness of who she was. She was a daughter, a wife, a healer, a leader. And most of all, she was a life of promise. When Sherri Rasmussen and John Ruetten began their married life in 1985, there was little reason to think that their happiness would be shadowed by the past. But behind every promise of a future lies the remnants of old attachments, and in their case, the attachment had a name, Stephanie Lazarus. John Ruetten and Stephanie Lazarus had met years earlier back at UCLA. She was athletic, lively, and ambitious, working toward a future in law enforcement. John was drawn to her confidence, her energy, the spark of someone who seemed to know where she was headed. Their relationship was never built for permanence. Friends saw it as casual, something born of youth, campus life, and the proximity of shared classes and late-night study sessions. By John's own admission, it was not serious, at least not to him. But for Stephanie, the connection dug deeper. Even as their romance cooled, she held on to it. Where John saw the end of a college relationship, Stephanie seemed to see unfinished business. And when John eventually fell in love with Sherri Rasmussen, that business became something darker. A lingering resentment, sharpened by jealousy, and fed by the feeling that she had been replaced. By the time John and Sherri were married, Stephanie had already joined the Los Angeles Police Department. She was a sworn officer with a career in motion, a badge that carried authority, and the kind of access that most people could never imagine. It was in that space, between professional power and personal bitterness, that Stephanie began reappearing in John's life. Sometimes it was subtle, a phone call, a casual drop-in. Sometimes it was more direct. She once showed up at John and Sherri's condo uninvited, asking to borrow ski equipment, lingering longer than a simple errand required. Sherri noticed. How could she not? Her new husband's ex-girlfriend, now a police officer, seemed to orbit their life, refusing to recede into the past. Friends recall that Sherri was uneasy. Not because she doubted John's love, but because Stephanie's presence carried a strange persistence. Sherri confided to her parents about her discomfort, describing moments where Stephanie seemed to push boundaries, reminding John of their shared history, even suggesting that she had missed what they once had. For Sherri, it wasn't jealousy, it was intuition. She felt something unsettling in Stephanie's demeanor, an insistence, an undercurrent of obsession that went beyond nostalgia. To the outside world, it may have looked like a love triangle, but in truth it wasn't. John had chosen Sherri. He had married her, built a home with her, and planned a future beside her. By all accounts, his relationship with Stephanie had ended long before, and his commitment to Sherri was clear. The triangle existed only because one side refused to accept its collapse. Stephanie Lazarus struggled to let go, and that struggle began to manifest in troubling ways. She wrote John letters, pouring out emotions, questions, longing. She expressed regret. She hinted at desires unfulfilled. In one encounter, she admitted to Sherri directly that she had slept with John even after he was engaged. The statement was less confession than provocation, a way to insert herself between husband and wife. For Sherri, the lines were clear. Stephanie represented intrusion, a reminder that the past wasn't finished trying to claim her husband's attention. As an LAPD officer, Stephanie Lazarus wore her authority like armor. She was well-liked among colleagues, known for her athleticism, especially her skill in women's basketball, and respected as a competent, energetic presence on the force. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. Friends and fellow officers would later describe her as someone who had a difficult time letting go of personal attachments. She blurred boundaries, mixing her professional identity with her personal grievances. And when it came to John Ruetten, she carried a sense of unfinished possession that clashed directly with the reality of his marriage. It's worth pausing here to consider the imbalance. Sherri was a civilian, a nurse, living her life in love and trust. Stephanie was armed, trained and shielded by the very institution meant to protect people like Sherri. In any confrontation, social or otherwise, the scales tilted. And Sherri felt it. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, Sherri's parents, became aware of the unease. Sherri confided in them about Stephanie's intrusions, her presence in their home, the awkward conversations that followed. To her parents, the picture was alarming but not yet a threat. They saw Stephanie as an annoyance, maybe even a nuisance, but not as a danger. How could they? The woman was a police officer, a public servant sworn to protect. And yet, Sherri's intuition kept pulling at her. Something isn't right, she seemed to say in her concerns. This isn't just about the past. For years afterward, Nels Rasmussen would replay those conversations in his mind, haunted by the idea that his daughter had seen something none of them wanted to admit, that Stephanie Lazarus's fixation was not harmless. In the weeks before her murder, Sherri's life was, on the surface, steady. She was working, thriving in her role at Glendale Adventist, and building her life with John. But the undercurrent of tension remained. Stephanie hadn't gone away. She still appeared occasionally, still lingered at the edges of their marriage like a shadow that refused to fade. Sherri told her parents that if anything happened to her, they should look to Stephanie. It was a statement made quietly, almost offhand, but it carried weight. Sherri sensed danger even if she couldn't articulate it fully. No one could have known then how prophetic those words would become. In hindsight, the tension between Sherri, John, and Stephanie was not just personal, it was structural. Stephanie's role as an LAPD officer gave her access to weapons, to resources, to training in control and manipulation. She knew how to cover her tracks, how investigations worked, where evidence might lead. Sherri, by contrast, was unarmed in every sense. Her defense was her intuition, her honesty, her reliance on the people around her to see what she saw. But those defenses could not match the kind of obsession that had lodged itself in Stephanie Lazarus's mind. And so the stage was set. A woman who had everything to lose, a woman who refused to let go, and a man caught in between, not by his own choices, but by the refusal of his past to release him. By February of 1986, John and Sherri were still in the early chapters of their marriage. Their condo, filled with the ordinary markers of new life together, was meant to be a sanctuary, but it had become, quietly, a battleground of unspoken tensions. Sherri tried to move forward. John, too, seemed to believe that Stephanie's intrusions were simply echoes of the past, not portents of the future. But Stephanie Lazarus was not done. Her jealousy had curdled into fixation, and her fixation was shaping into something irreversible. When the storm broke on February 24, 1986, it came not as a random act, not as a robbery gone wrong, but as the violent culmination of years of obsession, resentment, and refusal to let go. Sherri Rasmussen did not simply fall victim to chance. She fell victim to the shadows that had been circling her life, shadows she herself had recognized but could not escape. February 24, 1986, began as an ordinary Monday in Los Angeles. The winter air was brisk but not biting, the kind of cool morning that whispered of routine rather than tragedy. Sherri Rasmussen, as the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, a position of immense responsibility for someone so young, had her morning meetings lined up one after another. But as she dressed that morning, sliding into her bathrobe before settling at her desk to catch up on paperwork, Sherri had no reason to imagine she was living the final hours of her life. Her husband, John Ruetten, left for work earlier that morning. The couple had recently celebrated their first year of marriage, two people deeply in love, still adjusting to shared routines, still building the foundation of their life together. Their condo on Balboa Boulevard was modest but filled with warmth, Sherri's plants in the window, wedding photographs on the walls, and evidence of the life of two ambitious professionals learning how to balance work and marriage. By midday, the sun filtered through their living room blinds, and the silence of the apartment was broken only by the sounds of pages turning and the faint hum of life outside. But at some point, that ordinary calm shifted. A knock on the door, a forced entry, or perhaps something far more intimate. A face Sherri recognized, a confrontation she could not have anticipated. When John returned home that evening, nothing seemed unusual at first. He slid his key into the lock, unaware of what lay waiting on the other side. But as the door creaked open, his heart stopped. The scene before him was a nightmare. The condo was in disarray, furniture overturned, a glass table shattered, shards littered the floor like frozen tears. The VCR, a prized possession in 1986, was missing. Drawers were pulled open, their contents spilled across the carpet. For anyone stepping into that room, it screamed of a burglary interrupted, a robbery gone wrong. And then came the sight that would haunt John forever. Sherri lay on the living room floor, her bathrobe pulled awkwardly around her body, her skin pale, her lips blue. Her hands bore the marks of a violent struggle, her arms bruised, her knuckles split. She had fought, fiercely, desperately, against someone stronger, someone determined. Blood pooled beneath her head, seeping into the fibers of the carpet. She had been shot 3 times. John collapsed to his knees, his world collapsing with him. He cradled her, called her name, begged her to wake up. But Sherri was gone, the love of his life, his wife of barely a year, ripped away in a storm of violence that left no room for goodbyes. Within minutes, the Los Angeles Police Department arrived, filling the once cozy condo with flashing lights, heavy boots, and clipped voices. Officers moved swiftly, cataloging the scene, noting the signs of forced entry, the missing electronics, the chaos that seemed to tell a simple story. Burglary gone wrong, the words repeated like a mantra. Sherri must have surprised an intruder, fought back, and paid the ultimate price. It fit, too neatly perhaps, but in 1986 it was convincing. The investigators recorded the details with cold precision, the shattered glass, the smeared blood, the bullet casings, the evidence of a violent fight, one that spoke to Sherri's strength and will to survive. Whoever had killed her, she hadn't gone quietly. But beneath the official narrative, There were details that whispered something different. Sherri's car wasn't stolen. It sat in the driveway, untouched. Her jewelry remained on her body, unclaimed by any thief. And though the VCR was missing, other valuables were left in plain sight. Why would a burglar risk everything for a single piece of electronics, leaving behind items far more valuable? Those whispers went unheard, buried beneath the louder story the police told themselves. A robbery, a tragic accident, a random act of violence. But for John, there was no comfort in the explanation. He replayed the hours leading up to that moment over and over. Should he have stayed home that day? Should he have called her at lunch? Should he have known somehow that danger was waiting for her? Guilt pressed down like a suffocating weight. The apartment they had shared became unbearable, a graveyard of memories. For Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, the loss was immeasurable. Their brilliant, compassionate daughter, stolen in her prime. A life dedicated to healing others ended in brutality. They struggled to understand how such violence could invade their family, how someone so kind and selfless could meet such an end. The police assured them the case was being handled, that every lead would be followed, that justice would come. But beneath their grief, the Rasmussens felt unease. Something about the robbery gone wrong explanation didn't sit right. Sherri had been strong, yes, but this was more than random violence. The brutality felt personal. Still, in 1986, the Rasmussens had little choice but to trust the narrative. The detectives took their notes, filed their reports, and moved on. Sherri's death was folded into the larger crime wave that plagued Los Angeles in the 1980s, just another tragedy in a city already drowning in violence. But hidden within the crime scene were secrets waiting to be uncovered. Evidence preserved, blood, DNA, fingerprints, that in time would reveal a truth darker, more intimate, and more chilling than anyone dared imagine. For now, though, Sherri Rasmussen's murder was closed in a box labeled burglary. The city moved on. The detectives moved on. But for her family, for John, and for those who truly knew her, nothing about that explanation eased the ache. Because somewhere deep down they knew, this was not random. This was not chance. Someone had wanted Sherri Rasmussen dead, and that someone had succeeded. In the days following February 24th, 1986, the Ruette and Rasmussen households became places of unbearable silence. Sherri's laughter, once a constant melody, was gone. Her voice, her presence, the energy she carried into every room, it was as though the world had been dimmed. John Ruette wandered through the condo like a ghost. The shattered glass was gone, the blood scrubbed from the carpet, but the space felt uninhabitable. Every corner screamed of her absence. Her books remained on the shelves. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her perfume lingered faintly in the air. John couldn't escape her, nor did he want to. Each relic of her life was both comfort and torture. He replayed their last morning together in obsessive loops. The way she had smiled at him before he left, the soft curve of her hand on his shoulder. Had she sensed anything? Had he missed some signal that she was in danger? Survivor's guilt sank its claws deep into him. Friends urged him to stay with family, to get away, but he resisted. This was their home. To abandon it felt like abandoning her all over again. Meanwhile, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen found themselves drowning in grief laced with doubt. Sherri had been their pride, the brilliant daughter who had graduated nursing school at 20 and gone on to lead an entire department before 30. She was strong, fiercely independent, and deeply moral. To imagine her life reduced to a random burglary gone wrong felt like an insult. Loretta would lie awake at night, whispering to Nels, "It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense." And Nels agreed. He couldn't reconcile the story the police offered with what he knew of his daughter. If burglars had wanted electronics, why leave behind jewelry? Why risk killing her in broad daylight? And why did the scene feel so vicious, so deeply personal? When the detectives told them Sherri must have interrupted intruders and been overpowered, Nels bristled. "Overpowered?" he snapped. "You didn't know Sherri. She was an athlete. She was strong. If she fought, she'd fight like hell. Whoever did this—" He paused, his voice breaking. They knew what they were doing, and they knew her. But the detectives didn't want theories. They wanted neat boxes. Robbery gone wrong was easier to file than homicide with personal motives. So the Rasmussens grieved and doubted in silence. They buried their daughter with the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on their chests. At the funeral, Sherri's colleagues filled the church pews, stunned that their radiant leader could be taken so cruelly. John sat in the front row, hollowed out, barely able to stand. He stared at the casket as though willing it to open, for Sherri to rise, to reassure him that this was all some cruel misunderstanding. But the box remained closed. Behind whispered condolences there were murmurs. Some friends of the couple knew of tensions, whispers of a woman from John's past, someone who had not fully let go. They didn't say the name aloud, but the shadow of Stephanie Lazarus hovered quietly at the edges of the room. Loretta, perceptive and protective, caught the undertones. It planted a seed of suspicion that would take years to grow roots. For John, however, suspicion never had room to breathe. He was paralyzed by grief. He clung to the official explanation because the alternative, that someone close to him, someone in his orbit, could have taken Sherri's life, was unthinkable. His love for Sherri had been real, consuming, true. The idea that his choices, his past, could have in any way opened the door to her murder was a burden he couldn't bear. And so, in the weeks and months that followed, John moved through life in a haze. He returned to work, but the brightness was gone. Friends worried. His family watched helplessly. He was alive, yes, but in a way, Sherri's death had killed part of him too. For the Rasmussens, the ache became a mission. They asked questions, they pressed detectives. But as time passed, their voices faded into the background of a department overwhelmed by violent crime. Los Angeles in the 1980s was drowning in murder investigations. Sherri's case was just another casualty. Except to those who loved her. For them, every day without justice was another day of betrayal. The city moved on. The case file gathered dust. But the emptiness remained. And deep down, both John and the Rasmussens felt the same unspoken truth. This was no burglary gone wrong. Someone had wanted Sherri Rasmussen silenced. And the silence was deafening. For most families, the calendar is a record of celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries, graduations. For the Rasmussen family, every February became a wound that reopened. Each year marked the passage of time without Sherri, and worse, without answers. From the beginning, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen couldn't let go of their doubts. They tried to accept the police's robbery gone wrong explanation, but it clashed violently with their instincts. Their daughter had been beaten, bitten, and shot 3 times. The brutality told a different story, one that spoke of rage, not opportunism. Yet when they voiced these concerns, the LAPD's answers felt rehearsed. Detectives repeated the same script. Sherri must have interrupted a burglary. They pointed to the ransacked living room, the broken glass. They insisted it fit a pattern. But to Nels, the explanation rang hollow. He had spent years in corporate management. He knew when he was being placated, and he refused to be placated when it came to his daughter. In the months after the murder, Nels sat at his kitchen table late into the night, poring over notes and his own recollections. He kept binders where he logged every detail he remembered from conversations with the police. He asked questions that detectives brushed off. Why were Sherri's valuables, her jewelry, her purse, left untouched? Why was the attack so prolonged, so violent, when burglars usually fled at the first sign of discovery? Why was there a bite mark on Sherri's arm? Something intensely personal and unusual in a supposed robbery. Most of all, Nels wanted to know why detectives hadn't looked more closely at people in Sherri's personal life. He remembered the way his daughter had spoken, almost cautiously, about John's former girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus. Sherri had been unsettled by her presence, by the way Stephanie seemed to hover around John even after the wedding. "Dad," she had once said, "I don't think she's over him." Nels held onto that memory like a shard of glass. To him, it felt like a clue. But when he brought up Lazarus to detectives, the suggestion was dismissed. "She's a cop," they told him flatly. "You're reaching—" The word stung. Was it impossible to imagine that someone in uniform could also be capable of violence? Nels thought not. But his protests were drowned in the noise of Los Angeles crime statistics. The city was engulfed in violence. Gang wars escalated, crack cocaine flooded neighborhoods, and the homicide rate soared. Detectives were overworked and overwhelmed. Every week brought new bodies, new investigations, new crises. Sherri's case, an alleged burglary gone wrong, wasn't a priority. It was shelved. the file relegated to the stack of cold cases that gathered dust in precinct filing cabinets. The Rasmussen family, however, didn't move on. They visited Sherri's grave often, leaving fresh flowers and speaking to her as though she could hear them. They kept her photo framed in the living room, her smile watching over every family gathering. But the joy was gone. Holidays felt incomplete. Loretta often set an extra plate at the table, unable to stop herself from imagining Sherri walking through the door. Friends tried to console them with well-meaning words. She's in a better place. But the Rasmussens didn't want platitudes. They wanted justice. For John Ruetten, the cold years were filled with quiet torment. After the funeral, he returned to his routines, but the world felt foreign. He buried himself in work, in exercise, in anything that could drown out the memories. He eventually rebuilt his life, but never without shadows. He remarried, yet even in new relationships, Sherri's ghost lingered. He seldom spoke of her, not out of forgetfulness, but because the wound never closed. Privately, John struggled with guilt. He knew of the tension between Sherri and Stephanie Lazarus. He remembered the phone calls, the unexpected visits, the subtle but persistent presence of his former girlfriend. He knew Sherri had felt uncomfortable, even threatened, but John had never imagined it could escalate to violence. And when the police told him it was a robbery, he clung to that explanation like a life raft. To consider the alternative, that someone from his past could have murdered his wife, was a weight he couldn't bear, so he stayed silent. While the Rasmussen family grieved, Stephanie Lazarus thrived. By the late 1980s, she had carved out a successful career in the LAPD. She was known as energetic, competent, and ambitious. Her colleagues respected her. To them, she was another rising star in the department. What none of them knew, or perhaps what some quietly suspected, was that Lazarus was carrying a secret. If whispers reached her, she dismissed them easily. She had the badge, the authority, and the confidence of her peers. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen faded into the city's backdrop, a statistic swallowed by the chaos of Los Angeles crime. For Lazarus, it was as if the past had been buried along with Sherri. But for Nels and Loretta, the case never faded. They wrote letters to the LAPD. They pressed for updates. They begged for fresh eyes on the investigation. Every year, on the anniversary of Sherri's death, Nels called the department. He asked if anything had changed, if anyone was still looking. The answer was always the same. "We're sorry, Mr. Rasmussen. It's still unsolved." The frustration wore on him. He was a man of reason, a man used to systems working. But in Sherri's case, the system had failed. Loretta, meanwhile, sank into quiet despair. She dreamed of her daughter at night, sometimes vividly enough that she woke reaching out for her. She tried to find meaning in faith, but even prayers felt hollow against the weight of injustice. Still, they refused to let go. Sherri's memory demanded it. By the 1990s, new cases eclipsed the old. The LAPD was consumed by the Rodney King beating, the riots, corruption scandals, and the O.J. Simpson trial. Sherri Rasmussen's murder was nearly forgotten. The case file, with its photos, witness statements, and evidence, sat in storage. The bite mark swab, carefully preserved, remained untested in any meaningful way. Science was advancing. DNA testing was beginning to revolutionize forensics, but Sherri's case wasn't on anyone's radar for re-examination. Not yet. And so, year after year, the Rasmussen family lived in limbo. They celebrated milestones without Sherri, endured losses without her comfort, and aged without the daughter, who should have been there to help carry the weight. In 1993, Nels pushed again for the LAPD to take another look. He raised his concerns about Lazarus directly, urging them not to dismiss her as a suspect. The response was curt, almost dismissive. "She's not involved." It felt like a door slamming shut. But Nels didn't forget. He kept his notes. He kept his records. He clung to the belief that one day truth would surface. And then, at the turn of the millennium, whispers of new forensic possibilities began to spread. DNA databases were expanding. Cold cases were being reopened across the country. The Rasmussen family allowed themselves a fragile hope. Maybe Sherri's case wasn't dead after all. The years between 1986 and 2001 were a void, a space filled with grief, suspicion, and silence. For the Rasmussen family, it was a daily reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. For John, it was a quiet prison of guilt and longing. And for Stephanie Lazarus, it was a time of unchecked freedom. But history has a way of circling back. The secrets of the past do not stay buried forever, and in the shadows of Los Angeles, evidence waited. Patient, silent, ready to speak, the calendar pages turned, years stacking one on top of another, but for Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, time had frozen on February 24, 1986. For 15 years, the case of Sherri Rasmussen lay dormant, locked away in the LAPD's archives like a wound left to fester. But at the dawn of the 21st century, the world of forensics was no longer what it had been in 1986. DNA, the language of life itself, had begun to reshape the landscape of justice. What once was theory had become practice. What once seemed impossible, linking a killer to their crime decades later, was suddenly unfolding in cold case units across the nation. And in Los Angeles, that silent swab from Sherri's arm, the one taken from the bite mark the killer had left in a fit of rage, was waiting. It began quietly. In the early 2000s, the LAPD formed a new cold case unit, tasked with revisiting unsolved homicides in the light of DNA technology. Detectives were combing through evidence boxes, deciding which cases could benefit from this powerful tool. Among the countless files was Sherri Rasmussen's. To most, it looked like another burglary homicide from the 80s. But inside the envelope marked biological evidence was the bite mark swab, carefully preserved, untouched. The cold case unit decided to run it. When the lab results came back, the truth began to pulse like a warning light. The DNA profile from the bite mark was not a woman's. It was male. Immediately, the official narrative unraveled. For 15 years, the LAPD had insisted that Sherri was the victim of two burglars, possibly men, who had panicked when she interrupted them. But there had been whispers, even within the department, that Sherri's death had been personal, brutal, prolonged, a crime of passion. Now the science confirmed what Nels and Loretta had always feared. The killer was someone who attacked with rage, someone who had left their mark quite literally on Sherri's skin. But for the moment, that someone was still nameless. When the detectives informed Nels and Loretta of the DNA result, it was bittersweet. On one hand, it was proof their instincts had been right all along. Sherri's murder was not the random act of desperate burglars. On the other hand, it begged a new question. Who was this man? Nels felt vindicated but also exhausted. For years, he had been dismissed as a grieving father reaching for conspiracies. Now the evidence supported his suspicions. Loretta cried quietly at the news. The science was catching up, yes, but Sherri had been gone for 15 years. Nothing could return what had been stolen. Still, it was a glimmer of hope. For the first time since 1986, the case wasn't dead. Detectives began to comb through potential suspects. They checked DNA databases, looking for a match. But years passed without answers. The profile didn't hit in CODIS, the national database of offenders. For the LAPD, it was frustrating but not unusual. Thousands of unsolved murders from the 80s were facing the same challenges, DNA evidence without a suspect. For the Rasmussen family, it was agony. To know the killer's genetic fingerprint existed, but to remain powerless in putting a name to it was like being handed a key to a door with no lock. And here lay the cruelest irony. While detectives searched databases and files, the woman who had murdered Sherri Rasmussen was walking freely among them. Stephanie Lazarus had risen through the LAPD ranks. By the early 2000s, she was a respected detective in the department's art theft division. Colleagues saw her as competent, cheerful, dedicated. She was attending department functions. She was wearing the badge with pride. She was, in every sense, hiding in plain sight. And for the Rasmussen family, her name was still nowhere near the top of the official suspect list. The fact that Lazarus wasn't considered, even after DNA proved the killer had bitten Sherri, revealed a systemic blind spot. She was a cop. To many, that meant she couldn't possibly be a suspect. The burglary narrative, flawed as it was, continued to cast its long shadow. Detectives remained convinced they were looking for a male suspect, perhaps two men working together. It wasn't until new detectives inherited the case in the mid-2000s that cracks finally began to show in the department's resistance to looking closer at Lazarus. Meanwhile, John Ruetten lived with his own haunting knowledge. He had moved on, remarried, even started fresh chapters of his life. But Sherri's death never left him. When the cold case unit began asking questions again, John had to relive the worst day of his life. He acknowledged what he had tried to bury, that Stephanie Lazarus, his former girlfriend, had been around during his marriage to Sherri. That she had shown up uninvited, that she had once confessed she couldn't let him go. John had never believed Lazarus could be capable of murder. But the new detectives pressed him to reconsider. His testimony about her persistence, her jealousy, her refusal to let go, suddenly those details mattered more than ever. Forensic specialists re-examined the bite mark. The male DNA profile was unusual. It didn't exclude the possibility of contamination or secondary transfer. It raised as many questions as it answered. But there was something else in the evidence, latent fingerprints lifted from the crime scene. Prints that didn't match John or Sherri or the supposed burglars. The evidence had been sitting for decades, and now, in combination with the DNA, it suggested a truth that no one wanted to confront. The killer wasn't a stranger. The killer wasn't a burglar. The killer might have been someone close. By 2007, the LAPD cold case unit had begun to zero in. They revisited the Rasmussen family, and once again, Nels raised the name Stephanie Lazarus. This time, the detectives didn't dismiss him. They began to review her history. They learned about her relationship with John. They noted her proximity to the case. They acknowledged what earlier investigators had refused to see. Lazarus had motive, opportunity, and access. The walls were beginning to close in. But there was one problem. Lazarus was still an LAPD detective. Investigating her required secrecy, caution, and undeniable proof. The department couldn't risk exposing the possibility that one of their own had committed a brutal, cold-blooded murder, not without irrefutable evidence. And that meant going back to the bite mark. By the late 2000s, forensic science had advanced even further. DNA testing was more precise, contamination risks better understood. Labs could draw clearer profiles from older evidence. Detectives ordered new tests on the bite mark. They began building their case in silence, piecing together the puzzle that had been ignored for too long. And in the shadows of Los Angeles, the truth Sherri had carried on her skin for 23 years was about to erupt into daylight. The bite mark had waited patiently, through decades of silence, through years of denial, through the rise of its killer in the very department sworn to protect. Now it was ready to speak. And when it did, the voice of justice would be louder than Lazarus ever imagined. By 2009, the Rasmussen file, long buried in dust and silence, had transformed into something else entirely. What once had been treated as a robbery gone wrong was now under the harsh light of modern forensic scrutiny. The DNA analysis, the silent witness from that long-ago bite mark, had spoken with devastating clarity, and its voice pointed not to a nameless intruder, but to one of Los Angeles's own, Detective Stephanie Lazarus. The revelation rippled through the Los Angeles Police Department like an earthquake. Lazarus wasn't a ghost from the outside world. She wasn't a shadowy career criminal hiding in alleys. She was inside the very walls of the institution sworn to protect. A seasoned detective, a woman who had, for decades, worn the badge, carried the gun, and investigated crimes while concealing one of her own. But the truth was now undeniable. The DNA matched. The challenge, however, was monumental. Lazarus wasn't just any suspect. She was LAPD, arresting one of their own. Someone with access to weapons, with years of training, with deep knowledge of investigative tactics, required precision and secrecy. If she caught wind of the plan, there was no telling what she might do, so the trap was carefully set. Detectives from the cold case unit and their allies in forensics began to construct a quiet operation, a chess game in which every move had to be deliberate. Surveillance was tightened. Lazarus's routines were observed. The plan, to isolate her, to confront her with the evidence, and to secure a confession or reaction that would confirm what science already proved. On the morning of June 5, 2009, the stage was set. Lazarus was lured to an interview room at the Los Angeles County Jail under the guise of discussing a theft investigation. She walked in, unsuspecting, still carrying the confidence of a detective seasoned by years of service. But the room was wired, every word recorded, every expression studied. The detectives began with small talk, gently circling the edges of the past. Lazarus, casual at first, answered with the ease of someone who believed she was still in control. But as the conversation turned toward Sherri Rasmussen, the temperature in the room shifted. Her responses grew sharper, her composure strained. She deflected, minimized, denied. Yet the undercurrent of fear was there, palpable, unmissable. And then came the revelation, the DNA, the bite mark, the science that could not be reasoned away. Lazarus's world collapsed in that moment. The badge, the years of authority, the career built on solving other people's crimes, none of it shielded her from the truth now staring back at her. She was no longer the detective across the table. She was the suspect. When the cuffs finally closed around her wrists, it was a moment that defied comprehension for many in the LAPD. One of their own, exposed as a murderer. The betrayal cut deep, not only for the Rasmussen family, who had endured decades of grief and unanswered questions, but also for a department forced to confront the darkest reality, that justice had been obstructed from within. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, the arrest was a vindication wrapped in sorrow. They had long suspected Lazarus. They had long believed Sherri's death was not the random violence the LAPD claimed it to be. Now, at last, the truth was out. Yet the years could not be returned. Sherri's laughter would never again fill their home. Justice had arrived, but it had come on a timeline far too cruel. Still, as Lazarus was led away, her fate sealed by the bite mark she left behind decades earlier, there was a sense of finality. The cold silence of 23 years had been broken. Sherri Rasmussen's voice, silenced in 1986, had finally been heard through the language of science. The news of Stephanie Lazarus's arrest in 2009 did more than reopen an old case. It cracked open a wound Los Angeles thought had scarred over decades earlier. Sherri Rasmussen's murder, once dismissed as a tragic burglary gone wrong, was now reframed as something far darker, a crime of obsession committed by someone who had worn the very badge meant to uphold justice. For the Rasmussen family, the arrest was both vindication and torment. Vindication, because the suspicions they had harbored all along were finally validated. Torment, because the process of justice meant reliving the horror in the most public of forums, a trial. The prosecution prepared carefully. Their task was monumental, not just to prove guilt, but to unravel the mystique of a decorated detective and reveal the woman behind the badge. Their case would lean heavily on the forensic breakthrough, the DNA from the bite mark that had spoken with scientific certainty. But science alone was not enough. They needed motive. They needed the story. The story, as it unfolded before the jury, was one of jealousy and rage. Lazarus, once romantically linked to John Ruetten, had never let go. The prosecution painted her as a woman unable to accept rejection, who viewed Sherri not as John's wife, but as the obstacle standing in her way. Sherri's murder, they argued, was not a crime of chance but of passion, planned, personal, and brutal. The courtroom became a theater of dualities. On one side, Lazarus sat, no longer the confident detective, but the accused. Her face, once framed by the authority of a badge, was now marked by the weight of betrayal. On the other side, the Rasmussen family, carrying decades of grief, bore silent witness. Each testimony, each piece of evidence, was a reopening of old wounds. The defense fought hard. They questioned the integrity of the evidence, hinted at police bias, and attempted to cast doubt on the narrative of obsession. They argued that the DNA might not tell the whole story, that other suspects should not be discounted. But against the cold, immutable certainty of the bite mark, their arguments faltered. The most chilling moments came not from scientific testimony, but from the echoes of the past. Friends and colleagues recalled Lazarus's volatility regarding John, her inability to move on, her bitterness. These testimonies gave shape to the motive, filling the spaces that DNA could not. In March 2012, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom stilled. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, the words carried both justice and unbearable sorrow. Justice, because Sherri's killer was finally held accountable. Sorrow, because no conviction could restore their daughter's laughter, her future, or the decades stolen from them. Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. As the gavel fell, she was no longer the detective who once carried a gun and investigated crimes. She was now inmate, stripped of authority, her legacy rewritten by her own violence. For the LAPD, the conviction was a reckoning. How could one of their own commit such an act, and how could it have been ignored for so long? The trial forced the department to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, about the blind spots created when the accused is one of their own. For the Rasmussen family, it was the closing of one chapter, though not the healing of the wound. Sherri's absence remained, a silence that could never be filled. Yet in that silence, there was also something else, a measure of peace. Sherri's name was no longer tied to a cold file, forgotten on a dusty shelf. Her story had been told, and her killer had been named. Sherri Rasmussen's story is more than a case file. It's a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still prevail, that silence does not mean forgotten, and that truth has a way of rising, even decades later. But her story also forces us to look inward. How many other families are still waiting, still pleading, still holding on to memories while case files gather dust? How many voices remain unheard? Here at Vanished Voices, we believe those stories deserve light. Sherri's life, her laughter, and her promise will not be reduced to the night she was taken. Her name joins a chorus of others demanding justice, remembrance, and change. If this story moved you, if you believe that every voice silenced by violence should be heard again, then join us. Leave your thoughts in the comments, share Sherri's story, and let us know what cases you want us to uncover next. Subscribe to Vanished Voices so these lives, these truths, are never lost in the shadows again. Because every voice matters, and every voice must be heard.